gaslighting, distorting, invalidating, all of these tricks the ego will pull out rather than lose its source of empowerment when it gets that source of power through you. Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to Going Dotty. I'm Trace Egan, and in today's video we're going to be looking at the various different ways that the ego creates. So let's crack into it. In the last video in this series, we discussed the premeditative nature of the ego, and that the ego decides, makes decisions in advance, it prescripts its life and its world, and that's one of the ways that it goes about creating for itself that which it wants to achieve and wants to occur. Where this also affects is, this isn't just with regards to the material things or the physical manifestation of things. This can also mean that an ego will prescript the emotional meaning of an event, a conversation, or a situation. And that really hits things on a totally different level. It's like when people are having like two levels of conversation going on within the one conversation. An ego will often be talking to you about something where the conversation or the topic of the conversation is just a front for the real value of the conversation, the meaning that they are either trying to pass over to you or the response that they're trying to elicit from you. We call this dual consciousness, where the ego has a level of overchat going on in its mind's eye, and it's not really correlating that on the ground to the person that it's communicating with. So there's a real lack of honesty going on, because in that moment, not only is the ego fundamentally being very dishonest in the conversation that it's having, but the ego is also set up and established in such a way that if you were to ask the ego, or if you were to call out the ego that which it is doing, the ego would be incapable of perceiving that it's doing anything wrong. What we can say about an ego is, once an ego has premeditated what it wants to occur, what it wants to bring into event, the ego will very much hold itself in that grid. It holds itself within a certain space and environment. And if we talk about this energetically, they hold their electromagnetism in a certain way and manner. And that means that other people are going to be naturally inclined to flow their energy in such a way as to fulfill that for the ego. When an ego has decided what it is doing or how it wants things to be, when it holds itself within that grid of reference, an ego will be able to draw upon enormous reserves of informational energy to sustain itself within that grid. Once the ego is holding itself sustainably within a grid, other people will eventually pick up subtly on how they're holding themselves, what it is they truly want, and the people who are susceptible to that will start to flow in that manner. It's almost like saying at the very center of the nature of our form, we would all help each other as much as we can. And it's this weakness, this emotional weakness, that the ego instinctively knows and yet picks up on. The ego is waiting for beings that, or others, that it doesn't perceive as being as valuable as itself, and putting it out on those to uphold for itself what it wants to occur. So the ego is always outsourcing its creations. It's always putting pressure. It's using its magnetism on those who aren't as powerful, or as those that it doesn't seem to be as powerful. So if you're talking about a parent in a household dynamic, well, of course the child is in a disempowered position. If you're talking about a supervisor, a manager, or a boss in the workplace, of course the person who is lower down the hierarchical scale from them is going to have to bear the brunt of that personality, of that character, and the way that they hold themselves and operate within the world. Often when it is holding itself in a grid, the ego will have a sequence of hurdles that it needs to be overcome, or gates that another person will try and fulfill for them. And this brings us back around to the fundamentally empty nature of the ego. The ego will make it seem like you will get great reward for doing for it that which it wants. But what we find at the end of the day is the ego doesn't have any resources to share out. So not only does it maybe virtue signal initially that it is going to provide something for you that in the end of the day it isn't. Not only is it not going to do that, but an ego-orientated individual couldn't do that even if they truly did want to. Yet an ego will very easily allow other people to jump through hoops, to squeeze itself into these impossibly small, tiny, tight spaces. It will allow a person go through a significant amount of discomfort in order for the ego to get that which it is looking for. Egos really feel like they can control the oven of time. When things happen for other people, how things happen for other people. These are all elements that the ego, in its grandiose sense of self, feels like it is some power system over. And when we're talking about the narratives that the ego has for other people in its life and its world, which is covered in more detail in another video again, but when we're talking about the narratives, that's one of the reasons why the ego feels like this. If the ego sees itself to be in a power position over another person, it's almost like the ego is suggesting that through the grace of itself, it allows things to come about and come into effect for other people. And this is just layering up the various different ways that the ego creates in its world around it. It tells a story, it captures people in under that story, and then it uses those people, gets from them that which it wants, gets from it that which it can, uses that as much as possible, and then has very little to offer in return. The ego is always trying to fulfill what it wants in its mind's eye. As we say, it has a story, it has a script, it has something that it wants to come through to fruition. And the ego will go to extensive lengths. It'll use people, it'll use resources, it will not realise what it's doing. It will pull what it wants from what's available to it. So some of the other ways that the ego does this is through mirroring and projection. Mirroring and projection are two very, very big topics. So I'll just briefly mention them and go into them in further detail at a later stage as soon as I can get to it. But projection is essentially when an ego has decided a structure that it wants to occur, and it projects that thought onto and behind another person. Mirroring is where an ego plays a flow, plays a pattern, and falls into a mirroring dynamic with another person. So when we're mirroring, we are literally showing a repeated sequence again. So if you do one thing in one manner, another person will do the same thing in a corresponding manner, and so the flow or the pitch has been reflected, and we can say that we are a mirror of each other. What an ego does, when an ego captures a mirror and then it tries to control that mirror, the ego will have somebody in its peripheral that will represent something to it. But instead of the ego being able to treat that other person as a valid individual in and of its own self, the ego will then try to control through the narrative, through the suggestions that it makes. It'll be subconscious context and subcontext on the side of conversations, on the side of interactions. It will be a determining factor in how an ego chooses to communicate with somebody, the tone of voice, and all the subtle levels of communication that also go on within relationships and dynamics. So an ego will capture a mirror when one naturally comes about and occurs. So an ego will capture a mirror, but then it will also control that mirror. Because what becomes important here is what that mirror represents to the ego. All of this becomes relevant when we're talking about the symbology of self. When you have a person who is very deeply unconscious, they don't realise that the story of their life and their world is playing out in the world around them. And the ego has others as characters. The ego is not an embodied being that is pulling upon its own resources and, guiding the reins of itself. The ego is forcing itself and the movements of self through others in the world around it. When we are caught up in a dynamic with somebody, one of the ways that we can unpick that dynamic is by acknowledging, what does this person mean to me? So if you're stuck in a dynamic with an ego, one of the ways that you can start to unpick that dynamic is by acknowledging that you and this other person share a thread of connection of some sort. If you didn't, they wouldn't be bothering you. So it's sort of up to yourself to start figuring out, well, why am I in this dynamic with this person? Why do they affect me like this? What does it represent to me? What's the meaning in my life and in my world which has this person sitting in this place and space? And once you're able to do that, you're going to be able to start to enmesh away from the ego, because you're understanding the construct that you're in. And by bringing your awareness and your consciousness to it, by becoming more conscious in the interactions that you're having with an ego, you slowly chip away at the overall situation and you find yourself coming back into your own power and your own form. It takes an awful lot of energy, it takes an awful lot of awareness, and it takes an awful lot of consciousness. But this is how we build up our healthy boundaries for self, the membrane of our own experience. It's how we build up our energy system so that we have enough chi or life force vitality to be able to run our energy centers. We understand our psyche as being connected like a jigsaw piece to another mirror in the external. But when we don't like our mirrors in the external, life as a reflection is a concept that spirituality keeps on coming back to. When we don't like the reflection of life in the world, when we want to break away from that mirror, how we do that? We empower the self, we become aware, we build up our energy. That also means that we're going to have to carry ourselves differently when we're around egos. And that's equally very difficult. You know, an ego doesn't want to be treated differently to how it's used to being treated. The ego doesn't want to be brought to a reduced position. So the ego will use every tool in the toolbox to make it as difficult for you as possible. They will use any variety of mental abuse, emotional abuse, gaslighting, distorting, invalidating, all of these tricks the ego will pull out rather than lose its source of empowerment when it gets that source of power through you. One of the things that we find when we're in space with an ego is the ego, it pulls information from us, it pulls data, it pulls our mood, it pulls the feminine energy, your space, your mood on a day, your attitude, your good intentions, your good vibrations. When an ego feels this, it will go to extraordinary lengths to either take that from you like a succubus, literally energy vampire, if you've heard that type of phrase. They draw that energy towards them and they take it away from you. And these experiences are very disheartening when they occur. It can be very difficult to, generate the motor within self to be in a good mood, to be able to carry yourself in the world nowadays in a generally sound and grounded manner. So that's it for today's video, just trying to explain a little bit more fully how egos actually do end up creating in the world around them, when we can say that they are predominantly and fundamentally, they're negative creators, they're lazy creators, yet they still create, and how they end up doing that. So please let me know how you're getting on with the series to date. I'd really like to hear from you and get some feedback. If there's anything in more detail that you want me to go into, please let me know by leaving a comment. Please like the video if you found it useful. Please subscribe to the channel if you'd like to support me, and I will chat to you guys again. So look after yourselves.